Hi, everybody. Tom Hall here, Executive Director, Montclair Film and the Montclair Film Festival. Thank you so much for sticking around after our drive-in screening of The Soul of America. We're very excited to welcome the director of the film, Katie Davison, here for a Q&A. Hi, Katie.
Hey, how's it going?
It's great, thanks. I'm so glad that you were able to do this with us and to share this really important film, I think, for this moment in our history with us. And I want to start by asking you about your relationship to John Meacham and the book, Soul of America. How did you discover that project, and how did you come on board with this film? Did you read the book and think, I want to make this project, or did they come to you? How did that process work?
It was actually, funny enough, Brian Stevenson was a connection. I had just spent some time with EJI doing a project with him, and the Kuhnhardts were in the midst of doing True Justice with Brian Stevenson. And we had a mutual connection that kept telling me I needed to know who the Kuhnhardts were and that we were so aligned. And they put us in touch, and they were just starting this project, and they asked if I had heard of John. And I had seen him on Bill Maher, and I thought he seemed funny and interesting, but I didn't know that much about him. So they sent me a copy of the book and asked if I wanted to take a stab at developing it. And I was sucked in right away.
That's fantastic. And I think you did a really good job of sort of bringing him into it as well. Because sometimes, sometimes when books get adapted, the author is sort of extracted and the director becomes the narrator in a way of the project. Can you talk about working with John and including him as a subject in the film? Was he eager, reluctant? He's such a public figure, and I'm sure really comfortable on camera.
He was really reluctant to be a part of it, for his personality to be a part of it, really, because he's exists as an expert sort of in the space. And I actually wasn't really clear that that's what we were going to do in the beginning. We thought maybe it was going to be straightforward history. But the first interview I did with him, his schedule is just so busy. We met him in Boston, and he was doing a lecture. And we got to see him engage this audience. And what I found so compelling about the book was that he was using history as like a science, as a way to make an argument for compassion and kindness and reason. And I thought, well, like, who is this man who's making this argument? And it turns out this man is also traveling the country and making that argument in a way that was really meaningful. And I was so fascinated by that. And so I immediately wanted to spend more time with him on the road, getting to know kind of who he was. And as I started to figure out how funny he really is, which I don't know, once you start getting to know him, you see that he's hilarious. I wanted to be able to give that a little bit to an audience. I thought it could make it more fun and watchable. 100 years of history is a lot, so. Yeah, totally. Spice it up.
Exactly. And so I think the film does a really great job of balancing sort of his personality and him with the archival footage that you were able to track down and sort of the history of the country, and especially in the 20th century. How did you work on the archival material? I know it's drawn essentially from the arguments in the book itself, but also sort of the approach that he takes to bringing forward certain ideas about, like you said, compassion and empathy, and this idea that change has always been necessary. In a way, and that it's our sort of social contract that we end up coming together and moving forward, whether we like it or not, almost as a nation. So how did you decide on this archival material and how to underline those points using the archive, and then balance that with including him as a subject in the film?
That was the biggest challenge. Honestly, probably the hardest lift for us as filmmakers. And it wasn't just me; it was my whole team. I had a great archival producer, editor, co-producer, involved. And when I started with development with the book, it's so vast. 100 years from Appomattox to the civil rights, you can't possibly fit that into an hour-and-a-half film. So we kind of were looking at the space, beginning where he begins with Charlottesville and that connection that he makes, and starting from that point. And we found, I really wanted it to feel relevant. We knew that we were kind of shooting for a date sort of around the election, and we looked at what was happening in the country at the time and tried to hone in on some of the moments in history that we could really see ourselves in. And it sort of, he kind of naturally does it for us in a lot of his speeches. And as he was traveling around the country, he creates this argument. So we were able to use that as a little bit of a guide But then also the archival itself was a little bit of a guide for us. So as we started getting in, doing the research, which was vast, just going through the Alice Paul archive was 500 pages of transcripts, you know, like it just, that started determining a little bit of the story too.
And what was the access like for the archival footage? I'm always sort of fascinated by how people find material in the research process and what they aren't able to get their hands on. Were there any sort of motherlode moments or moments of like real frustration where you're like, I wish we had something that could better illustrate this point that we're trying to make in the film?
I mean, Jill Cowan, who is our archival producer on this film, is just a genius. You know, she just has this length of experience in the doc world, and she just blew my mind. Honestly, she was such a great research source for us. But I mean, I think there definitely were the treasure troves, like the Alice Paul 500 pages of real transcripts, but also we found a lot of like footage from within the Japanese American incarceration like moment from within the camps. That was kind of this amazing moment. The Dorothea Lange photos had recently become available. Those were really compelling and exciting. But yeah, I mean, I can't really recall any one moment, you know. I think like throughout the process, we were just kind of in shock and awe, you know, as things came to life.
And getting George Takei and, you know, John Lewis in the film and sort of living at the time of shooting anyway, reminders of our history who were with us when the film was made. And, you know, we've just lost John Lewis. We were lucky to show at this very drive-in the John Lewis Good Trouble film earlier this summer. But to have access to those folks and have them really bring a different personal perspective to the narratives was a different strategy as well. It sort of enhanced the arguments in the book. Can you talk about how you brought them on board and sort of the decision to include these outside voices?
As we were sort of figuring out what the structure of the film itself was going to be, I think it kind of became clear that we wanted witnesses. You know, John is this great narrator. He has an almost photographic memory for facts, but, you know, we thought it would be compelling if witnesses from the time period could kind of take us through and uplift like the argument itself. So once we had already figured out kind of the structure, what we wanted to focus on, we know we wanted to focus on women's rights. We knew we wanted to do something that connected to child separation on the border. And we knew we needed to talk about civil rights. And so, you know, within that space, we had interviewed Dale Manami and Don Tamaki, and they, when we were with them, and also Karen Korematsu, who did not make it into the film because we could have just made a whole film about, and whole films have been made about that moment, you know, but, and as we were doing, you know, making that piece, they said, you have to talk to George Takei. And that was really, and they set it up and he agreed. And because that community is so incredible and does so much work around getting the message out, educating people so that this doesn't happen again. And then with John Lewis, the Kuhnharts had a connection with him because of the film that they had done on MLK. And they filmed with him several times. So it took a lot of time to actually get there. And the day that we filmed with him was actually the day of the impeachment proceedings, where he made that announcement. So we were sitting in the place where they kind of like put all the little reporters waiting for him as he was making his announcement down on the floor, kind of weeping, you know. Yeah. And then we just got to spend this incredible, he and I actually cried in the interview together, going through just some of that experience at that time. And then he was just so generous with his time. He took the entire crew into his office and showed us his walls and talked to us about his farm, you know. It was really a special moment.
Did you guys know that was coming when you went to shoot, or no?
I think he announced that he was sick maybe a couple weeks after we had been there. I can't remember the exact timeline, but it was very soon after.
Wow, yeah, it's always, you know, stunning to see Americans who've, you know, lived through the moment. Sometimes I worry people get detached from the past. It becomes abstract to them and not a real thing. And I think that's another great thing about this movie is that it reconnects us with the past. I think that was, in this sort of through line of what is the nature of the country, which is John's sort of thesis. I will say, coming into watching the movie myself, it feels like we're in a very sort of radical moment in American history. There's a lot of social upheaval happening from a lot of different people with a lot of different goals and tactics all over the country. And yet I took a lot of comfort from this movie. I was worried maybe this, John's a very moderate guy. I think he's sort of straight down the middle. The times feel like moderate. There's no moderation in this time at all. Everybody's like super polarized. So I'm wondering about if you confronted this idea of polarization outside of John's perspective as yourself as a filmmaker, and how you approached sort of including his very sort of moderate and I think heartening take that there is some sort of collective soul of the country.
I think hope is not a partisan issue, right? And we often, I think that as a filmmaker, I think that probably maybe John and I's politics don't completely align, and I thought about that going into the making of this film. But what I really appreciate about what John does is that he speaks to people that are far beyond, the bubbles that I live in when I'm on the East Coast or the West Coast, making my little films. And I think I'm from Texas originally, and my mom and I have vastly different political beliefs. And making a film like this, to me, was about sort of reconciling this disconnection that we have, because I think that history can be a way where we can see through these things that divide us, and see something as fact, like whether or not you agree with the political belief, looking at where we've been and then what happened next, I think is informative. Does that make sense? Like, I always think it's interesting the amount of people that you meet that always think they will have been on the right side of history.
Right.
But if you look during the civil rights movement, the right side of history was unclear. A lot of the population was really against it. Who knows what side we would have been on? Mainstream beliefs were incredibly racist, and I think once we begin having an understanding of that, like, it makes where we are more clear. Now, like, I do have questions about, could the type of bipartisan consensus that happened with LBJ at that time, is that possible now? Like, I don't know. I'm not a scholar, but those are questions that I have that I want to look deeper into. But definitely in terms of this film, like, it's John's voice, it's John's message. You know what I mean? But I think for this, what's incredible about his message is that in this time, regardless of his political beliefs, you can look into this darkness and find that hope. And I think that's important for all of us right now.
He's clearly thought very deeply about this topic and has come to his hypothesis and his used his evidence to underscore it, I think, in a very powerful way. It's not something you'd refute. On the other hand, I'm wondering, like, were there moments between the two of you where you sort of like, put a finger in his nose and said, "Hey, John, come on, really?" Or you challenged what he was doing? And I don't think that that's necessarily even if it was just for like dramatic effect to pull something out of him as a subject, like to get him to talk a little bit more. Was there any sort of tension between you guys to get on the set to get this thing a little more energy, or at least for you to
was on this call?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I definitely tried to poke him. I definitely did, and it was great. It was challenging. And also, I think it made, like, by the end, I have come to the end of it. At the beginning, I was like, I'm going to challenge this man, with his moderate beliefs. I don't know how I feel about the Bush presidency, but I just have nothing but respect for him now. I've really been in the trenches with him for a year. I've watched how he conducts himself, in life, in the public sphere, the work that he tries to do. He's genuine, he's authentic, and I think now we're in a space where we shouldn't denigrate good. He's trying, and I think that is important. That's what we need right now.
And yeah, that's great. And another thing about this movie that I enjoy is that often when you see John or any other sort of public intellectual, they're given 45 seconds to make a point that ties the history of the country together in a way like, you're a historian, why does this moment matter? Thanks so much. And it's over. Do you know what I mean? Whereas here you've at least it's not a book, it's a film, but it's like, it gives him room to explore these ideas. The film gives these ideas room in a way. Did you guys conceive of this as sort of an antidote to punditry or a way for him to for you to flesh these ideas out? And what is it like, thinking about him as a public intellectual and for him working as a public intellectual and then given this sort of space in the film?
I mean, no, but we should have. Yeah, that's a great idea. Maybe I'll think about that now. I mean, I don't know. Do I think of him as a pundit? It's interesting to conceive of what he is. He has such a strange, diverse career. I mean, he was a journalist first, and I think that he kind of looks at himself as a journalist. His roots are in journalism, and then he moved as a writer and now a biographer. And I don't know. Do I think of him as a pundit? I don't really. But definitely the film itself, the interest around the film was enabling him to develop an argument, spend more time with him, and I think that just it naturally occurred as it came to life, as he became sort of a personality with us on the road, that you got to see a little bit more of who the real John is, and I think that's some of the stuff that I love most about the film. I think he comes off as endearing, but I mean, I'm curious to know what people think,
Totally. I mean, well, I was just thinking, we see him on Bill Maher as a panelist, and I've seen him interviewed on long form news magazine programs and things of that nature, where he's not given the air that you gave him in this, or let alone what a book would give an author. So I thought it was quite interesting to see a public intellectual given space, because so often they're not. And we're asking for, they're there to tie everything together for us through their perspective, and yet not given the time to do it, which is always so frustrating.
Should be,
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe we should give public intellectuals more space.
100% agree, which I'm so glad you did.
Yeah.
So for a final question here as we head out for the evening, I'm wondering a little bit about, so the film is coming out, soon. It's election season 2020. The country's in turmoil. This movie definitely has a message. Was that part of your process? I mean, obviously the film is tied tightly to current events. Who can keep up with them? By the time this Q&A airs, we have no idea where we'll be in 2 weeks, let alone
Aliens
tomorrow.
Landed,
exactly. It's like, what? Send in Amy Adams to translate. Arrival's one of my favorite. Anyway. So we don't know how that's going to be. So there's this danger of making a long form documentary film in a very disruptive time. And yet, you finished it, I watched it, we're watching it tonight at the drive-in, and it still feels fresh and relevant to what we're going through now as a conversation. So I'm wondering, was that the intention was let's get this thing done before the 2020 election, get this out there so that people can use this historical information in their own sort of consideration of their role in our democracy?
Absolutely. I mean, look, history will always be relevant, right? I mean, there's an argument to be made that ignorance is the reason why we perpetuate these things again and again and again. But I think that for me particularly, this is what I feel I can do. This is why I want to make films. I want to try to help, I want to try to uplift the conversation. And this was such a great project. It was a chance to do that, but really it was HBO just had our backs. They really did. And they really made sure that we could get a good air date with this. So I just have to thank them, from the bottom of my heart, because I think that it makes a difference. It really is relevant to the moment. And I just am so thankful that the stars aligned in that way, because I don't know that they always do.
Right. And so all we got to do now is get everyone to push play on HBO and watch this movie.
Look for it on HBO and HBO Max, and vote.
And vote, exactly.
And vote. I mean, I think that's the biggest message of the film. We have the capacity to create change. And we can't forget that no matter what happens.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Katie, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for bringing the movie to the Montclair Film Festival. We're really proud to be able to share it. I think you guys have done a real service with this movie. It's, again, it really made me think, and we were proud to invite it and grateful that you guys accepted. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom.